So welcome to today's webinar, Cities Learning from Pandemics, in our series 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemics. This series was initiated by Luisa Bravo, founder of the Journal of Public Space, and by me, Hendrik Tieben from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Now, in the meantime, we started in May. Currently, the numbers of global infection has risen to 22.4 million cases. So there's still no end in sight. But the center shifted to North and South America, while Europe is just kind of experiencing the second wave. And where I'm in Hong Kong, we are just going through the third wave of infections. In this context, we want to ask how cities learn from pandemics, and could collect a great group of panelists from different parts of the world, from South Africa, from Hong Kong, and also Nairobi, Bologna, and Ecuador, and United States. And if you want to get in contact with us during the webinar, you can send us questions anytime, or you can send us also an email later. You can also write us if you want to be a panelist in this series. We still plan for September to have webinars in that month, before we will make a short pause and then have our big symposium on November 6 and 7. If you have missed any session so far, you can find all the videos of earlier webinars on our City Space Architecture YouTube channel. And this is everything from me now for the introduction, and I want to pass on to Luisa Bravo, who will introduce the panelists and the topic today.
Thank you, Hendrik, for the introduction, and thank you, the speakers, for joining today for this very important webinar, I would say. After now 14 webinars, we are starting the discussion regarding what we can learn from what we have already experienced globally during the pandemic that is going to last for a while. So today, the webinar on cities learning from pandemics is an attempt to develop a discussion among experts, having also the program manager from the Global Public Space Program at UN Habitat, Cecilia Andersson, as a commentator. We would like to also get some feedbacks from the audience and questions, if possible, using the Q&A button. I think that it is important also to learn from what we personally experienced during the pandemic. And since I'm Italian and I'm based in Italy, I thought that maybe some reflections also from Italy could have been useful just to start this conversation. So I'm not an historian, I'm not an health expert, I'm just an urban designer, but I'm trying to understand from history, in previous pandemics, reactions and decisions that led to different rules and initiatives related to urban planning and urban design. I'm now sharing my screen here. I think many of you are accustomed to this kind of maps that we constantly review almost every day to see how cases are increasing in different countries. Now it's refreshing, but as you can see from this map, in the coronavirus disease pandemic, Italy has been hit very hard. Actually, Italy was the first European nation to be affected by COVID-19. And the first two cases were two Chinese tourists on January the 30th, traveling to Italy. Today, August the 20th, we count more than 250,000 cases and more than 35,000 deaths, with more than 7 million swabs. Italy is currently the 17th country in the world for number of total cases and the 6th in the world for number of deaths. The Italian crisis provoked by the COVID-19 is the most serious event in Italian history after World War II. It is a national human health and economic tragedy. We faced almost 2 months of full lockdown from March to May, and later less severe restrictions for another month. And in June, commercial activities reopened and public life in public space restarted. We have to say what we have learned is that in early stages, there was not so much adoption of standard hygienic measures. Also, instructions from the government were not very clear, and were also very difficult to accept restrictions from the majority of population, many complaints, many fines with the police. You know that Italy is famous for very active Italian life, for socialization and kisses and hugs. Anytime we meet and we are together, we stay very close, and we actually share a lot when we also eat together. The rapid spread of the COVID-19 and the very dangerous dangerousness of the disease was very different from the normal influenza, and were initially very much underestimated by the government, political parties, and the population. You have to consider that Italy has the most elderly population in Europe and the second most elderly population in the world after Japan. So COVID-19 has a strong age dependence for the severity of the infection and the risk of death in the beginning, and recently we are experiencing new cases. We are approaching a second wave, new cases from young people and even from children. It is famous a case that happened recently of a 5-year-old girl that went to hospital and is currently facing a severe crisis due to the COVID-19. Also, healthcare workers in Italy paid a very high price with more than 11,000 confirmed cases, and also 100 clinicians killed by the COVID-19 and many with burnout syndrome. And this is happening almost in every country. But the problem in Italy, even if we have a very good healthcare system, is that we have only a very modest number of ICU beds and very few sub-intensive care beds. So overall, we have 5,090 ICU beds, 8.4 for 100,000 population, and 2,601 beds in coronary care units, as opposed to much higher numbers, for example, in Germany or in the United States. But as we want to learn from previous pandemics, we have to recall that, and here you can see in this map that we have current situation explained from the Johns Hopkins University. This is a very well-known map that many are sharing also on social media these days. And in Italy, we also have this map that is, also producing current cases in yellow and total cases in red. So now we, as you can see here, we are experiencing less cases currently. So we are flattening the curve, but actually, since it is the summer and many are on vacation, and especially young people, the government is worried because the curve could become higher, especially now that in September we are supposed to go back to school, and families and children and 10 millions of Italians would be engaged in school activities. So the curve could actually rise again. And so we are actually facing now a lot of discussions because of the second wave. But as I said, we have to learn from the past. So COVID-19 was not the first pandemic to strike Italy. Almost 700 years ago, the Black Death hit the medieval Italy, and there was no expertise in viruses or bacteria. But health officials understood quite quickly that they had to implement some of what today are the world's first anti-contagion measures. And many cities in Italy, also in many books, we have stories of what happened during that period. Something which could be nice to refer is that when we had the Italian plague in Italy, the citizens of Tuscany decided to implement wine cellars. They wanted to sell wine through these wine windows here. Buchette del vino, known in Italy. So they could actually sell wine to tourists and visitors, so that they could actually enjoy their time outdoor while feeling safe through also some sanitation procedures using vinegar. The Black Death killed a third to a half of Europeans. So it was a major health emergency. And then later after that, cities started to reconsider concept of density, low density to give enough space for social distancing. And during the Renaissance, especially in Europe and in Italy, many urban planners started to think about parks, urban squares and promenades that are the legacy of beautiful city centers that we experience every day in our Italian and European cities. As I said, I'm not an historian, so now here I think we can learn more from the first speaker that is joining the discussion, Ian Morley from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who is associate professor in the Department of History and a well-known historian. He wrote many books and was interviewed by many journals and TV channels. He is part of the International Planning History Society and has been visiting fellow in many different universities internationally. Thank you for joining, Ian, and now your time to tell us more about history.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So again, thank you for the introduction, and of course my my gratitude for giving me the opportunity to speak today as part of this very informative webinar series. My presentation is in 3 parts, and I'll begin my talk by putting forward some very generic remarks as to past-present connection between cities and infectious illness. My first comment is that we must not overlook the fact that the history of cities is the history of disease, and likewise the history of disease is the history of cities. Accordingly, for my second comment, it's imperative to acknowledge that cities in the past and still today are sites of exposure to bacteria and illness. Cities have long been and still are the locales, indeed instruments, of intervention with regard to public authorities safeguarding citizens' health. So thirdly, in relation to the prior point, innovation in health strategy and the laying out of the urban form has been swayed through time by fear and the tragedy born from the diffusion of virulent disease. Yet as a final introductory remark, notwithstanding the shared lineage of planning and public health, it is important to realize that in many parts of the world, especially in recent decades, that health as a facet of the planning system has been undervalued. Hence, it has only become part of the conversation once a critical problem arises, and the context of COVID-19, therefore, may serve to hasten the process of addressing this apparent disconnect. So into the second part of my presentation. As urbanists, we're all aware that there's no shortage of evidence as to the evolution of urban environments in past and contemporary eras. And whilst many academics and persons from a range of professional backgrounds have been lucid in stressing that a variety of determinants affect the form and meaning of built fabrics, what is equally significant is there is broad consensus that by the 1800s, at least in Western civilization, that urban planning theory and practice took on new dimensions and perspectives. As to why the 19th century is universally acknowledged as being a turning point, the social, economic, and environmental impacts triggered by industrial revolutions cannot be overlooked. As an upshot of the rapid industrial and urban growth, 3 features in the built fabric took on importance or supremacy, these being the factory, the railway, and the slum. However, in my view, a 4th component existed. It was the municipal park, and that is something that I'd like to talk about in a moment. But first, in spite of us recognizing that modern city planning was initially devised as an outcome of political elites becoming conscious that administrative infrastructure created in earlier times to safeguard urban environments was impotent under the dynamics of heavy industry and rapid urbanization, the application of new rules and procedures to regulate, for instance, the design of residential districts, was profoundly swayed by the expansion of medical knowledge with regard to 3 allied matters, they being overcrowding, insanitary living conditions, and the widespread presence of infection. As accounts from Europe and the US make clear, industrial change in the 1800s rendered a heavy price for the laboring population. It became noticeable as the 19th century unfolded that distinct spatial distributions of urban disease and mortality existed. Not only was urban life expectancy considerably less than what it was for those residing in than in rural locales, it also varied greatly between districts within cities. However, with respect to urban space, and that being the core theme of this webinar series, whilst within the pre-industrial city, several types of easily accessible spaces existed, such as the marketplace and town square. Owing to the greatly enlarged territorial size and density of urban places during the 1800s, public space for recreation was much less reachable. Awareness of this actuality, alongside seemingly frequent outbreaks of illness and the impact of medical thinking emphasizing the role of miasma, led to 2 notable developments in places like Britain. Firstly, in 1833, the report of the Select Committee on Public Works provided a foundational survey of open space available for public use within major urban centres. Secondly, in exposing the need for more public spaces, the report had pertinence to ongoing discussion regarding social improvement. Reformers, moralists, and others had earlier promoted the standpoint that access to urban land would refresh body and mind. In this frame, the search for new urban space, solvable via the creation of public parks, was perceived to supply social, physical, and psychological benefits. Subsequently, up to the 1880s, more than 180 urban parks were laid out. Many were substantial in size, while some cities, Liverpool being the prime example, established not just one, but a number of large green spaces. Sanctioned by the passing of both local and national laws, 13 in total, the value of establishing green spaces to health, virtue, and happiness became widely recognized and was reinforced towards the end of the 19th century by lobbyists seeking to protect open land bordering cities, as well as by the rise of the garden city idea with its notions of low density living and accessibility to nature. Yet in my third part of this presentation, in linking back to our present day situation, it is vital for us to acknowledge how public health concerns, and so the quest for safety from social disruption, in both the past and today leave the indelible imprints upon the cityscapes in which we live, work, and use. In view of the widely accepted affiliation between people, health, and environmental form and infrastructure, in our current time of crisis, how may we shape or maybe reshape the planning process so as to promote the use of the city and its spaces as a critical infrastructure for well-being, physical and emotional, for all urban dwellers? Thanks to empiricism, evidently, we know that good cities serve many purposes. They facilitate, in part through their open areas, comfort, relaxation, cultural opportunity, as well as passive and active engagement with nature. Yet herein lies an inferential danger. It is assumed by many members of the public and many of the politicians who represent them that as an upshot of city planning's ideological and pragmatic advances through time, that its application as a tool of the state nowadays will assure urban security, inclusivity, resilience, and sustainability, i.e. planning can make all cities good, in inverted commas, regardless of local circumstances. Certainly, as examples such as 19th century Britain testify, an interface can exist between an urban planning system, contagious disease administration, space making, space use, and social betterment. Yet to manufacture a crossing point between these elements and then to harmoniously apply them in order to make planning pertinent to all is enormously complex and can be knocked off course by a number of factors. But as a historian, expanding awareness of planning in the past helps lessen the risk that our present day societal improvement goals will not be achieved. History permits us to better understand that urban planning challenges are not merely technical. Yes, technological and design matters are hugely important, but so too as examples are culture and politics. Politics frames the scale of opportunities and challenges of the city in all its facets, and in turn it is the major conduit through which collective action of people is, or should be, organised, articulated and projected. As such, history encourages us to better appreciate not just how our surroundings came into being, but the process that brought it into being. It also supplies us with other valuable points of guidance. The knowledge garnered from studying cities and their past planning processes augments our understanding of how planning ideas, policy making, and cultural practice reciprocally enrich. Plus, it advises us, as touched upon earlier in my talk, that epidemics have distinct socio-morphological imprints. Accordingly, history enlightens us that the experience of contagion will vary between social and racial groups within the city. This knowledge can let us better understand capital flows, not just in the sense of why friction-free global capital falls flat when the ambient risk of places and people coming into contact with germs grows, but who in times of fear invests in property at the urban fringe or hinterland in order to maintain class privilege. Likewise, it widens parameters to rethink the anti-poor, anti-freedom of movement bias upon those left behind in cities at times of great social challenge. History reveals too that public space can help facilitate community resilience to disease. Reading the urban past also tells us that health crises expose and exacerbate prevailing social, economic, and environmental fractures, tensions, and injustices. Given this, we can more thoroughly appreciate and acknowledge that modern planning's evolution from sanitizing cities in the 1800s to the designing of healthy communities in the early 1900s to by the 1970s applying sustainable development notions has in part been inspired by human tragedy. The past occurrence of epidemics, we should not forget, has spurred the creation and development of paradigms still crucial to configuring urban settlements today. That is to say, ventilation and neighborhood units. Per se, history teaches us that just as much as people need planning, in conjunction, planning needs people. And arguably, planning's evolution feeds from their distresses. So to conclude, and briefly conclude, historians, given their possession of the ability to explain change over time in space for different urban actors, can expose how and why space is a physical form constructed in complex ways. In conjunction, they can supply alternative lenses to knowing shifts in the relationship between built form, its design, and its use. This matter has massive resonance should we venture in the future to advocate a more localized solutions approach to public health, because if nothing else, the COVID-19 pandemic has explicitly demonstrated that global normative strategies do not always work as well in the real world as they do on paper. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Ian, for this informative perspective based on history. And I actually do agree that we need more resilient public space to, to find some relief from this pandemic. But it is very important that we do not reinforce inequalities that are already existing in public space. So learning from the past, but trying to improve and learn also from previous mistakes. Of course, it's very difficult to predict the future, but I think that there's a lot actually to discover from previous measures and previous restrictions on social distancing also, and also related to the planning model that some cities in Europe and worldwide followed after previous pandemics. So it's very important that we have a clear look at the past to learn more about what to do next, because I have this feeling that the pandemic will last for a long time, especially here, waiting for some good decisions from government and decision makers to take care of us all. Okay, so now we move to South Africa with Ayanda, the head of research and knowledge management department of the city of Johannesburg's Park and Zoo Agency in South Africa. Ayanda is a social scientist, passionate about people-centered public spaces that connect people from diverse backgrounds. Her focus is on how shared spaces are designed and built in a manner that struck the heart of the place, no matter where that is. Thank you, Ayanda, for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, Louise, for inviting me. And hello, everyone. So my presentation today is centered around the fact that we are all in the crisis. It's very hard, but we are experiencing it differently depending on our standing in society. But be that as it may, there's a big opportunity, maybe a once in a lifetime opportunity to change things, to reimagine our cities, and also to reimagine the kind of spaces that we built. I think what we're learning is that, as the previous speaker said, we need to build spaces that are place-specific, that take into account the histories, the particularities, and so forth. But also we need inclusive spaces, but not just inclusive, but they need to be equitable and community-oriented public spaces, meaning as we build these public spaces, how do we begin to build communities? In terms of the lessons that we are learning, I'll just walk you through like some of the key lessons for the continent, but more specifically for South Africa. I think the crisis has really turned the spotlight on deep societal inequalities and systematic challenges. And these are things that we knew already because they emanate from history. In the case of South Africa, they emanate from colonialism, apartheid, and we can see the connection between history and, in the case of apartheid, spatial apartheid planning, and also in terms of health. And at the same time, it has worsened other challenges that we have, the standing items, things that we've been advocating for, the plight of people who are experiencing homelessness and informal workers, and issues like domestic violence. But at the same time, the lockdown restrictions as a result of the pandemic, it sort of introduced us again to our neighborhoods. We begin to see how we live, whether good or bad. But at the same time, we have these policies that talk about integrated and sustainable human settlements. But we see now they are not really integrated. So I think the question is, what becomes the role of public spaces in addressing those challenges? And maybe it won't take public spaces to address everything, but certainly it can contribute to the social change that is needed. And as we are doing that, I think it's important not to slide back with respect to other standing items like issues around climate change, and for Africa, the fact that we've got youthful population. So this is just a graph to demonstrate what we're talking about. If you can Google today, just Google green apartheid. There's a recent journal that has been produced, it has shown how the pandemic has revealed green apartheid in South Africa, where you see suburbs adjacent to informal settlements, suburbs that are leafy, lushy, adjacent to informal settlements that are dusty and with nothing. So how do you begin to deal with those things? And one of the statistics, the data that is showing us is that in these leafy suburbs in South Africa, you've got rich people, white people who've got public space like in 700 kilometers away. At the same time, you've got people living in informal settlements, mostly black, in townships and informal settlements, with the access of green spaces 2.6 kilometers away. So those discrepancies, you know, so going forward, what is the role for public space in terms of dealing with that? And then in terms of informal settlements, we saw sharper focus in terms of informal settlements. Again, it's about the relationship between private and public in terms of how we build settlements. And then I think as cities, we must really strengthen tactical urbanism, the role of small-scale improvements that go a long way in terms of developing a sense of community, really working with inhabitants of informal settlements. And I must say, coming from Johannesburg, I think we need to change our attitude. We like big infrastructural projects, and we are so scared of experimenting and spending just less money on things that really work. So those are the things that we need to change going forward. And I think we all know the issue of informal economy, that 62% of all the workers in the world are informal, and more so in Africa. And you find that the majority of people are women that are working in informal economy. And with the lockdown restrictions, you find that schools are closed, meaning that women have other added responsibilities, domestic responsibilities. So they've been bearing like the brunt in terms of the pandemic. So I think as government, as cities, we are not valuing enough the contribution of the informal sector, which is really a buffer between employment and unemployment. So we need to find ways on how we support the sector rather than to put punitive measures. And then what you've seen is that people have been hungry, queuing for food, and it's not a new thing. People have been hungry, you know, before the pandemic, but now it's like an expose, you know, of all these challenges. So how do we deal with that? So the pandemic has really worsened food insecurity. Also because most of people are working in the informal sector, meaning that they depend on the daily wage to sort of eat. But also it showed us how critical it is, the informal sector, you know, in terms of food security, especially in terms of informal food traders, the distribution of food. So in terms of looking at public spaces, what is the role of public spaces in terms of growing food? And we know that one of the benefits is not just growing food, but also is issues of nutrition and also the process itself, issues of healing and also community building or social cohesion. So we've got cases already on the continent where this works. In Madagascar, we've got projects where people like small farmers are working with private sector and also in schools, because one of the key ingredients for success is the partnership, you know, in growing the food, because you need to sell if you want income. There are also cases in Kenya and also in South Africa, and also issues around vertical gardens or pop-up gardens, fruit trees, rooftop gardens. And I work for city parks. It means that horticulturalists, landscape architects, you know, they've got a bigger role to play beyond just beautifying our public spaces if the continent or the world is like in food insecure. The other issue around the discrepancies or look at public spaces with the eye of inequality is the fact that we need to integrate the public spaces. Maybe we need to look beyond access and look what exists and integrate them. So the tendency coming from city parks is to, or from the city, is to build these projects or look at public spaces as projects. So roads department or transport will build a road, it's a project for them. City parks is a project for them. So we're building silo parks or silo public spaces, not really talking to each other. So the connectivity becomes so important. Connectivity in terms of public and private spaces, in terms of open and public, but also in terms of the entire urban fabric. So there's two cases in Africa that I want to cite. One is eThekwini, where they're starting to build linear parks, really integrating hardened surfaces and sidewalks with parks and also with conservation nodes. And in Lagos, they're building a linear park where they are linking various public spaces, but also connecting them with wetlands and also promoting biking and climate smart agriculture. So things like that, if we are talking about the benefits of healthy cities and also resilient cities. The other issue that we are learning is that we need a new way of governing, you know. So what becomes the role of non-state actors? What we saw during, what we are seeing during lockdown is that you've got these big, nice projects by central government that they want solidarity fund, or there's a food aid system, you know, for vulnerable groups. But there's a problem in terms of those projects cascading to the ground, meaning there's something missing. We are missing an important constituency. How do we touch vulnerable groups? And maybe something that we are weak at, like every day, which brings in now other role players, especially civil society organizations. I think pre-COVID, there's been some fragmentation in terms of how they work, but because of COVID, we saw some solidarity, NGOs coming together, help people, and really bridging the gap where government, you know, was found wanting. And another area besides food, distributing food, is the issue of messaging. We know that civil society organizations, when it comes to advocacy, they are very good. So they managed to work in places like Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, with communities, especially in informal settlements, to use public art to communicate about coronavirus. Because one of the issues in the beginning is the fact that people were saying that no, Black people can't get COVID. So really, they really help us in terms of demystifying that, you know. And we saw them also when it came to issues of domestic violence. Because of lockdown restrictions, you know, people are sitting in this or living in this one-bedroom house with 10 family members, and really domestic violence like sort of shoot up. And again, around issues of homelessness, they helped the state in terms of making sure that there are shelters. And lastly, we saw them in terms of water and sanitation. Because remember, if you are living in a slum, a public space is an extension of your home. So meaning that's where you get running water and so forth. So they become so important. And lastly, in terms of messaging, I think as government, we really need to learn the messages, and the message or the language is place specific. And I was doing some work around building a network of public space advocates, calling people around the continent. And once I say park, oh, they know park is a public space. And then once I say a place where there's life, or life and public space, those are the two things that go together. So in terms of how people define public space, it's like life. So we need to be cognizant as well as we're doing our messages in terms of the language of the communities. And how do we do this? How do we build this equitable, community-oriented, you know, place-specific public spaces? I think the place for us where to start is to map, is to understand our communities and map the public spaces that we have. So what we did in Johannesburg is something that Habitat, working with cities and also with universities and communities. They do this community-led mapping of public spaces with a view to develop citywide public space strategies in the long term. So what happens is that with this mapping, especially if you are doing it with communities, you get to understand whether you've got enough public space, or you've got surplus, you know, or you are lacking. And you get to see the discrepancies or the fragmentation that this public space are not connected, you know, to other places. And there are spin-offs in that, because of you get to see that by having safer spaces, you need to connect this park to the school and also to the recreation center and so forth and so forth. And that way you get to empower the community. But also as city officials, also we need to learn more. We tend to learn more from the communities. And also we check issues like who owns the space, you know, how much land that is there, and so forth and so forth. So I just want to mention that UN Habitat uses this app, it's called Kobo Toolbox, which is very simple to use to help communities to map their spaces. And it brings up the role of universities in terms of working with government and so forth. So the development of city-wide public spaces, in the end, it helps you to say, okay, now you've got this disparity in terms of unequal public spaces. So how do you start in terms of prestiging the city, rehabilitating, restoring our cities to make them equitable or inclusive? And another thing that I think we are not doing very well as government is community engagement, doing it adequately. It's messy and making. So what we tend to do as government is to just have community hall meetings, and that is not real community engagement. So we can't really understand our communities. So we need to develop alternative tools of engaging with different segments of society. So those pictures are from a pilot project that we did in the inner city of Johannesburg, where we partnered with an NGO called Sticky Situations to really help us in terms of engaging people differently. So what we saw that there's humility that is needed from the side of government. We need to go out of the offices and be there, and we need to be humble and listen to communities. So you need city practitioners that are conscious socially, and also to look at communities, not those poor unemployed people, and see ourselves as part of communities, therefore we are resourceful. And just to mention two things, we partnered with UN Habitat, but also with GIZ, Violence and Crime Prevention Program. So UN Habitat helped us by using Minecraft and training young people and women in the inner city in terms of what kind of desires do they have or needs, or how do they want to contribute to making the parks safer. What was powerful for us is how we managed to lay in street kids and the kind of needs that they had. One of them said that we want an information wall in parks. It's something that we never thought about, you know. We built the same parks with playgrounds and benches and so forth. They wanted something different. So the use of technology sometimes can bring in other diverse needs. And one of our placemaking ex-members, they are using Kuja in Uganda, refugee camps. So that one is a real-time customer feedback system where you get to know what are people needing. So during lockdown, they did this, and parents said, we just need toys or just a ball for the kids. So it helps us to be attuned to what is happening in our societies. Just last slide, which is a project that we are working on. We are very excited about it. We are building a regional network for public spaces and placemaking for Africa. This is a hub for learning and knowledge sharing. It's a hub for African city councils, urban scholars, practitioners, and advocacy groups. For instance, with this pandemic, we had Ebola in places like Sierra Leone, Congo, and so forth, HIV and AIDS in South Africa. And of course, our central governments were learning from each other, but we missed an opportunity, just people to people, to learn about strategies. So the principle of this hub, which we want to develop to establish a center for public spaces in Africa, is how do you really build a design, place-specific, equitable and community-oriented spaces. So we want to learn from other cities and we want to build public spaces. We want to know what are universities teaching, you know, your School of Architecture's planning and so forth, what gets taught there, and who teaches? Do they have local realities? Is there a practical element? How do you mainstream public space to the level of housing? It must be there in the curriculum. And this is, we can do it very easily, tapping into the networks that we have, like Placemaking X and others, to bring in case studies in the curriculum. Because if you look at the curriculum, mostly it's outdated, and these theories and practices from the global north. And also we're working with a civil society organization, because we see that we need to influence how policy and planning happens and how budget, you know, is being allocated. Most of the time, public space is the first sort of budget line item to be hit or to be cut. So we need really to connect practices and to produce knowledge and messaging. And lastly, we need to be capacitated as city councils. How do we do this mapping, you know? And what does SDG mean? And how do we make sure that we are delivering or we are achieving the objectives? And how do we build these well-designed, managed public spaces? Thank you.
Thank you, Ayanda, for this perspective from South Africa. Actually, I think we can learn also from what you are doing regarding how to spread the information regarding public space culture, because I think we need to work on this also in other contexts, not just in the global south, but also in the global north. You mentioned an equitable, community-oriented and sustainable approach, which is something that it is not fully developed in terms of knowledge, skills, education. Also in the global north, there are some missing issues related to public space, also in education, as you pointed out. So I think there is very much work to do on this, and this is why also this initiative is trying to stress public space as a key element also for sustainable urban development. And so that's why we also try to engage experts from different fields that somehow are enriching the discussion and pointing to public space, as I said, as a key element for everyday life and for communities. I think it is also very important what you said regarding empowering non-governmental actors in the process of making public spaces successful. And during this pandemic, we are actually experiencing that we very much rely on decision makers, politicians, local and national governments. And so we hope that they are skilled enough, especially on public space, now that difficult decisions have to be made, and these decisions will affect millions of people in Italy and globally, you know, and we see that some political leaders, according to the news, actually are not working properly. And so large populations are very unhappy on the way these leaders are handling the pandemic. So there's very much to say after what you presented, but thank you for putting all these issues on the table. I hope we will have time later during the roundtable discussion. Okay, so now we move to Ecuador, to Ana Medina. A PhD architect and master in collective housing. Anna is currently researcher and professor at Universidad de las Américas in Quito, where she teaches architecture and urban design. She works in Quito, but also in Madrid, and she also collaborates with Collabo at the Keio University in Tokyo. She also organizes architecture workshops and performances. She has many international collaborations, and she has also published widely on public space. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Luisa and Hendrik. It's a pleasure to finally get to meet you, even if it's online. And to my colleagues that now we are sharing this time this morning, well, morning to me, because as I said before starting the call, in Quito, and it has been my headquarters for the last couple of years. So let me go into the screen. And basically what I want to talk about this morning is informal situations and radical responses situated in Ecuador, which has been one of the worst countries that have faced the current pandemic. In fact, some analysis suggest that Ecuador's death toll is 15 times higher than its official tally of coronavirus deaths. As today, the official number indicates over 6,000 deaths, but at the same time, the Ecuadorian Social Security Institute has declared that there are over 30,000 deaths from the average from the last couple of years between March and July. But also Ecuador was one of the first countries in the region that imposed strict measures such as closing borders and a total lockdown of the population that lasted over 70 days. So what happened? This is Guayaquil, and Guayaquil was maybe the most affected city by COVID. And this is the typical image of the city now, which is like a call for tourism, investment, construction, development, and so on. But the reality is that a large number of people live under these conditions of informality. But in fact, this is not an exception. In fact, the UN has estimated that 1 billion people live in informal settlements or slums worldwide, while in Latin America, over 113 million people live in these conditions that are very precarious, where people do not have access to basic services as drinking water or even water supply, garbage collection, electric energy supply, or internet, and so on. But also in the Ecuadorian Constitution, it guarantees a dignified housing for all. But social housing has a minimum of 42 square meters for the nuclear family. Now, so the nuclear family is both parents and 2 or 3 children. But the reality also is that in these houses, maybe 2 families live or a multi-generational family lives here. So it's around 9 people that live in these 42 square meters. So when the government said stay at home, they didn't take into the consideration of these situations, no? Like the overpopulated housing, overcrowded housing, the homeless people, weather in the case of Guayaquil is very hot and humid, and not everyone has AC. So that's why many people go outside and they live basically in the public space during the day. But also culturally, Latin America people are very social and they develop these relationships on the streets, on the public space. And sadly, this was the image, this was the result of bad policies made by the government, not during the pandemic, but even before. Basically, the pandemic just made them visible. They showed the reality of that situation that was very precarious for the people. So what was happening in Guayaquil at the time, in April and May mainly, terrified everyone, not only in Ecuador, but also all around the world. Meanwhile, in Quito, most of the people that could stayed at home, but also because weather is a little more friendly. They stay indoors because the temperature on the average day goes from 15 to 25 degrees. So people really didn't have the need to go outside at the beginning. Streets started to be marked for social distancing, and this is like the official propaganda from the city council saying that we need discipline to come back to normality, but yeah, what was normality at the time now? So little by little, people started going out. Yes, wearing masks and keeping the social distance, but this kind of order didn't last that long. Hospitals soon started to collapse. Also, the Institute of Statistics officially announced that over 1 million people got unemployed in comparison to the 300,000 people unemployed in June in 2019, from a population of 17 million people and with a workforce of 8 million people. So this number is basically huge. but also the city started showing this kind of social spatial codes. No, this is actually an image from Medellin, but it was replicated to many other cities in the region, in which the red flags indicate that people inside, people living in these houses were hungry. So these social situations basically needed to be visible. And it's precisely these social situations that have been manifested in Latin America, because it's a culture that traditionally manifests itself in the public space, either for dancing, festivals, religious ceremonies, children playing in parks or in the streets, or also demonstrations, riots, and protests. So people are accustomed to occupy and to inhabit the public space, as it happened last October with the social protest that rose first in Quito, and that was resonated around the region, as we well know, in Bolivia and Santiago de Chile especially. And this happened again. Now, these political actions by the commons that reflect the need to disrupt this new normality that was only getting worse and worse for them. So the lack of leadership, corruption, and decisions taken weren't helping the population, and that provoked a new wave of protests, not as massive as the ones in October, but some more spontaneous, nuclear, and specific, kind of like acupuncture protests. With a historic record of unemployment rate, the health system collapsed. Cuts on education and jobs, especially in the public sector. People, with all the fear of getting COVID, had a bigger rage. So they started going out to the streets because they didn't have any other option. And somehow started getting this kind of economic activity or economic income. Now, with large numbers, yes, wearing masks, but not necessarily keeping the social distancing, the public space became the only space for them to receive any kind of income, reflecting considerably the social injustice now. For instance, only in Quito in 2017, there were officially 9,000 street vendors. By 2019, this number went up to 22,000 people. And today, there are 26,000 children and teenagers registered as street vendors, while adults and seniors haven't been counted yet. And this is ridiculous because just a couple of days ago, 5 months after the COVID outbreak, the government launched this official app to track people that got COVID. But because people don't trust in the government, in fact, 97% of the population disapprove the government, this won't work. But at the same time, other institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank has produced this kind of manual, no? Which are focused on the local governments and go into different areas like health, housing, basic services, urban infrastructure, social development, social security, labor, economy, and education. But these are top-down policies. They're focused on the local government. So what the common of the people could do? The term informality is usually associated to irregular activities, to spontaneous, occasional, unfinished, and so on, all related to the economy and habitat. However, in Latin America, urban life is intensively marked by a high level of social inequality, in which during the last 40 years, the streets have been filled with commerce, and it has changed also the urban landscape. So this wider and faster occupation of informal activity in public spaces during the pandemic has motivated to proliferate conflict among these actors, no? Among the informal activities, formal commerce, but also residents and the police. So the official projects or interventions done by city councils or local governments in the public space consider mostly morphology, typology, and the aesthetics. And they relegate to the background the social, political, quotidian, and cultural relationships, and disregard the society as an active actor in the urban life. They ignore basically the capacity of the public space for adapting to the new and often to the uncertain realities of the city, especially through informality. So informality is not necessarily something bad, it's just part of our culture. And what we have to do first is to understand and then to adapt it and use it as a tool. To set this value on informality in public spaces, there should be interventions that go beyond the formal, a search for the social appropriation that are adequate, suitable, comfortable, and basically they are like radical responses to serve the purpose of the quotidian life. And that's what happened during the COVID. Now, people were demanding for immediate actions to the governments. And the main action that the local government did in Quito was creating these pipelines in this very important avenue in the city. So once they have taken the space and they occupy it and make it theirs, people see as the opportunity to not go back and change something that wasn't working before. So the occupation of the public space is very important. But I also believe that there should be more collective spaces, not only public spaces, or maybe something in between, to be sensible to the people, but also to create this kind of soft city, no? Otherwise, this is what could happen. This is the most important square in Quito. It's the Independence Square, and as we can see, that's the government's headquarters. And as we can see, the government has literally set a border and separated them from the people. They cannot see the reality, so that's why the responsibility of people now is very important. Thank you. That would be it.
Wow, thank you, Anna. I was taking notes while you were talking. So thank you, because you actually pointed to some of the issues that we discussed also in previous webinars, existing inequalities in public space that now become more visible because of the pandemic. And so then protests happening in many countries and in many cities, and the need for these temporary, informal and tactical approach to overcome this specific situation, giving power also to a network of solidarity that comes from grassroots communities. So this cooperation between the government and non-profit grassroots communities was already one of the topics that before the pandemic was part of the discussion on public space. So the feeling is that through this pandemic, we can finally understand the real value of public space. And also we are now more aware about the mechanism of functioning of public space intended as a process with different actors rather than a merely design top-down activity. So public space is much more complex than that. And so now during the pandemic, we understand much more, and everyone, I mean, because everyone was affected by the impossibility to reach outdoor spaces and was impacted in their personal lifestyles. And so I think now that this awareness on the importance of public space is quite well established. But it is good that actually you pointed to all these issues related to Ecuador, because actually in Italy we do not know a lot about Latin America and especially Ecuador. So thank you for this comprehensive presentation. And now we move to United States, to Jason, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Northumbria University. So soon you will be with us in Europe. Jason, research focuses on the politics of urban space, especially the concept of right-wing or illiberal urban space and the relationship between online and offline public space. Jason.
Thank you, Luisa, for the invitation, and Hendrik and Cecilia. Look forward to your comments. I've been a skeptic of these types of virtual forums, but you've proven me wrong. This has been an incredibly valuable series. So perhaps two caveats before I start. The first is that, as you mentioned, I'm not in Singapore. I'm talking about Singapore. So my perspective is very much looking from the outside in. And so I'm thinking more about global connections and comparisons rather than perhaps the everyday experience of being in Singapore. Perhaps there are others on the call who are better placed to talk about that. And the second is that I'm not an architect or someone who studies health. I am an urban geographer and I study space and spatial politics. So that's the angle that I'm coming from. The theme of my talk is rescaling and the way that space and place are networked and rescaled, especially in this context of COVID and the authoritarian responses to COVID. And perhaps it's appropriate as I'm, as you mentioned, based at an English university, but I'm currently located in the United States, talking to you in different time zones around the world. So we are very well acquainted with the way that space is networked and rescaled. And I'm assuming you can all see my screen at this point and hear me. Okay, that's good. On a date in late June every year since 2009, thousands of Singaporeans converge on Hong Lim Park, a 0.94 hectare grassy square to commemorate and support LGBTQ life in the city-state. The event has grown over its 12-year history from around 2,500 attendees to more than 25,000 by 2019, becoming the largest annual civil society gathering in the country. That such a large public gathering occurs in space-constricted Singapore is notable. There are many restrictions on public assembly, including the Public Order Act, which stipulates how public space can or cannot be used. That Pink Dot is an LGBTQ-themed event is even more notable. Singapore maintains restrictions on LGBTQ life and expression, including the Section 377A of the Penal Code, first instituted by the British in the 1930s, which criminalizes homosexuality. So for a number of reasons, the success of Pink Dot, both its visibility as a public gathering and its global representation as a marker of civil rights, are remarkable. Enter, in February 2020, COVID-19. Like many cities and countries, Singapore responded forcefully, instituting strict shelter-in-place orders and restricting access to public spaces like Hong Lim Square, which is pictured here. Even relative to other places, Singapore became known quickly for its authoritarian response to the crisis. One example of this was the mandatory quarantine of all international arrivals for 14 days, with frequent checks and surveillance to ensure compliance. Seen as an efficient and effective response, these measures have been borrowed and implemented elsewhere too, with the United Kingdom and other countries now considering, now implementing similar mandatory quarantines for international arrivals, including myself in a few weeks. Singapore's authoritarian state society apparatus is sometimes seen as an alternative model, where the civil liberties are curtailed in order for city life to be optimized. And the Singapore model is a frequent referent for successful urban development and governance and placemaking agendas. So the fact that its COVID-19 response has been lauded is not surprising. However, early successes obfuscated a sobering reality. Singapore is dependent on migrant labor, and most manual jobs, construction, landscaping, domestic work, etc., are filled by men from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and India, and women primarily from the Philippines. The men live in crowded company-sponsored dormitories on the city's fringe. These laborers are ubiquitous in Singapore. At the same time, they are rendered invisible. Constructors of the city's lavish buildings and gardens, but absent from public life and public space. On Sundays, these and other domestic workers are free to congregate and socialize on their day off from work. Parts of Singapore's Little India, for example, which is pictured on the right here, are overtaken by throngs of foreign workers who use the time and space to meet up with friends or connect with those from their hometowns. Public spaces, streets, plazas, hawker food centers, and department stores like the legendary 24-hour Mustafa are central to both the socialization of migrant laborers, but also to provide a platform for visibility and to form relationships to and with the city. The outbreak of COVID-19 among the migrant workers erased this visibility as tens of thousands of workers were quarantined out of sight in their residential living facilities. A dual narrative then emerged with two competing but very different images circulated and recirculated via global media. One version of Singapore that had successfully fought and conquered COVID-19, reopening and allowing occupation of public space once again by citizens deemed not to be a threat. And another version where migrant workers were condemned to suffer in clammy, air-conditioned dormitories, out of sight and mind, removed from public space altogether. Likewise, Singapore's LGBTQ community, which emerges into visibility each June by occupying Hong Lim Park, was also shut inside, relegated to the private sphere of domesticity, present but invisible. So I want to trouble the notion slightly that authoritarian responses to COVID-19 and restrictions on public space are some sort of Singaporean unique characteristic. Places like Singapore and also Hong Kong to some degree are often under the global microscope as another model, as what can happen in an authoritarian response. And I think that as we've seen in the past several months, we've learned that authoritarianism is not reduced to place. It is rather a global process, and that the fact that perhaps some of these restrictions on public space have always been the case outside of places like Singapore. Indeed, we've seen the trend of privatization of public space, hyper-surveillance, police and racialized brutality. These have been facets of daily life in the West for a long time. So I want to sort of trouble this notion that we can look to places like Singapore as global unique models to learn from. Rather, I think we should be learning from, in some ways, ourselves, learning from how these processes play out. And what COVID-19 has done has accelerated these processes and made the planetary nature of them more visible. And in fact, some of the very particular restrictions on public space in Singapore, as I mentioned, were implemented during the colonial era. These were British laws that were instituted mostly in the 1930s and 40s against the dissent in the Maoist uprisings that were taking place across the region at the time. So this is the other narrative of Singapore that started to happen in April when there was an outbreak in its migrant worker dormitories. And so the first month of the pandemic had very few cases, and many countries started to rapidly adopt what Singapore was doing. And then around mid-April, there was a massive spike in cases. And these were mostly taking place in places pictured here, these dormitories that were clearly unsanitary and overcrowded. And unfortunately, I would argue that many places have also instituted this type of response, that we've had an uneven response in many cities, and informal settlements have been cloistered in much the same way. At the same time, public spaces have become rescaled globally. We've seen this the way that the plight of the migrant workers has become a globally networked discussion piece, that the migrant workers may be invisible inside Singapore's borders, but on the web, it's become part of global media. Much bigger representation and visibility in the public sphere than perhaps would ever be possible in the territory of the city-state. And likewise with Pink Dot, the LGBTQ gathering, which cannot take place anymore in the park, but not only is it networked with sister events in places like London and places not currently in lockdown, it's also networked online. You can see the Pink Dot Facebook group has 68,000 likes, which is far bigger than could ever physically gather in space. Another interesting angle is the way that we're seeing a mix of public space, local state, and global market. The way that social media companies like Facebook are forming another scale of public space, and are both subject to territorial laws and larger, creating their own laws. The way that, for example, Trumpian rhetoric on fake news has merged with Singapore's efforts to restrict digital discourse, and Facebook, which operates inside and outside of the city-state, has formed a new frontier of public space. So I think I'm coming to my time. Just to conclude, again, the theme today was learning from cities, and I pose the Singapore example, not so much that we can learn from Singapore as some kind of unique model worthy of study, but rather as an example of the accelerated authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world. That is not a new thing, but it's been brought into stark relief, the way that Singapore is a sort of mediator, a simulacrum of global authoritarian imagery, mediated by local space, by the global space of places like Facebook. Silicon Valley makes combinations and reattaches to space. And I think that we as researchers and urbanists might do well to look in the mirror and understand our role in creating some of these spaces in many places. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. I think it's very important that you pointed out to some of the topics related to invisible groups, low-income workers and migrants, those vulnerable communities that we do not actually consider so much, but we as urbanists and public space researchers and activists actually have clearly in mind anytime we deal with activation or design of public space. The pandemic has raised this issue of fake news and misinformation, and I think this is also affecting the current use of public space because of issues related to safety in public space. In Italy, we are now experiencing again and again this issue of migrants traveling from across the Mediterranean Sea to Italy from North Africa, and still this concept of safety are overlapping with the use of public space during the pandemic. So those are recurrent topics that are very much important, especially now that we need to create a kind of network of solidarity among people. So instead, many said physical distancing, but not social distancing, because now we have to stay together and work together to become stronger and to face this emergency. So thank you, Jason, for your perspective. And now we move to Cecilia Andersson. She is the manager of the Global Public Space Program at UN Habitat. The program helps to improve capacity of local government institutions and communities, establishment of local and global networks and partnerships, support the development of local and national policy and development of citywide strategies, and the pilot demonstration projects, knowledge management, advocacy and tools, and provide expertise and advice to ongoing projects by local government in order to increase the impact and improve dimensions of inclusion and leverage public space as a development tool. For those who do not know City Space Architecture, who is promoting this initiative with the School of Architecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, is a partner of UN Habitat in developing the Journal of Public Space. So thank you, Cecilia, for joining today. Your role is commentator, so please let us know about your comments and ideas coming from today's presentations.
No, thank you very much, Luisa, and thank you very much, Hendrik. Actually, this whole series has been really a wonderful opportunity to actually learn what's going on a global level from different cities. And I think actually it's really nice to now sort of move into that phase of actually seeing, not only seeing what is going on, but actually learning from what is going on the local level, on the city level. And one of my reactions might actually be, or one of my comments is that, and building on what Ian was saying, is that, are we really learning from history? Are we learning from the past? I'm actually not sure. I think we sort of started again on the city level, on the community level, to try and come up with some solutions without actually looking at what has happened in history. And taking into consideration, I think, not only the technical, which Ian brought up, but also the political and the cultural, which is really important. And we often don't actually look at that and those dynamics that take place on the local level. And I think for us, I mean, public life is really the essence of our cities. And during this time of COVID, it has really sort of impacted on our life, on public life in cities. And I think we need to sort of direct a lot of our efforts towards trying to create those, and now is the opportunity actually to create those inclusive, healthy and resilient cities and spaces that we require. I would actually like to start with the marginalized communities, and I think Ayanda touched really a lot on that, and Anna as well. And we're seeing a lot of innovation actually coming from there. It's really the marginalized communities that have been impacted a lot by COVID, both from a livelihoods perspective, but also actually from a health perspective. And just like Ayanda was saying, about 60% of the urban population are actually employed in the informal sector, and many of them are actually women. And it's been very difficult for a lot of the communities, the marginalized communities, in trying to be able to mitigate or be able to manage this whole situation of the COVID. But I think communities are actually very powerful. They're the powerful asset. They have immense capacity for organizing themselves, and we've been seeing that on the ground. And also actually tailoring these cost-effective solutions to their problems. Just as an example, in one of the slums here in Nairobi, there's a youth group that has been very engaged in, first of all, advocating or explaining a little bit, communicating the issues around COVID and how the communities needs to then take precautions with wearing masks and physical distancing and similar. But also actually being very creative in starting then a small urban agricultural project to then support the most marginalized in that community to be able to access then some good nutritious foods. So I think this is what we also need to look at, what the communities are actually coming up with. And what I'm also seeing a bit is that government is actually listening to a lot of what's going on the ground. Because in the beginning, I think that just Jason touched upon that, you know, maybe the first reaction of government is to be more authoritarianist. But I think that's changing a little bit. I think we're coming into that phase where government is changing. And, you know, they've been grappling with this situation, not really knowing what to do and being more restrictive and putting sort of laws and regulations in restricting people's use of public space. But now they're sort of moving into this new phase of trying to sort of open up. Now, how are the ways to be able to open up? And I think they're listening. They're trying to see what they can actually do. And they're being challenged. They're being forced to rethink a little bit. And we're seeing that not only in the developed world, but also in developing countries, that they're being challenged to think differently and be more inclusive. We're seeing that they're coming up with strategies of trying to reopen. We're seeing a lot of this city-to-city learning, which I think is really important. And then building on what Ayanda was saying, and the opportunities of this Africa Center for Public Space, is that we need to create those opportunities to learn from each other. Because I think people have felt quite alone sometimes in how to actually handle this situation. And governments as well, not only communities and people, individuals, but also actually governments have felt quite lonely. So this opportunity to exchange, to be able to learn, to be able to see what's going on is really important. and then embracing that new way of governing. And I think Jason and you brought that out quite clearly, that a lot of the cities that we work with, especially in the developing countries, they have laws and bylaws that actually go back to the colonial era. Like here in Nairobi, for example, the bylaws around loitering in public space, people can be arrested for loitering in public space. So, and that's a law from 1970 to 1974, and it has not been revised. And I think now is the opportunity to revise that. And I think we're seeing that as well, that governments are trying to see how they can accommodate people better, how they can try and react to this situation. I think it's also really important, these small scale improvements, which Ayanda brought up, because I think, you know, sometimes government feels completely overtaken by trying to do large scale projects and implementation. And we don't need to do that. I think that small scale, the temporary, is a way to actually start and then be able to come up with better solutions. I think we're also seeing now during this time that 15-minute neighborhood, the concept of that, which the mayor of Paris is really promoting. And a recent survey that Gell Architects did showed that 87% of the populations in the cities that they surveyed were just staying within their neighborhood. So this is really important. We need to plan more on the neighborhood scale. We need to provide those small spaces on the neighborhood scale that can then accommodate people being able to have a good quality of life. I was actually listening to a webinar the other day, and I think we're also actually moving in our cities more from that to a more slow-paced city. Can we say that? That we're actually sort of moving more for a more walkable city, cyclable city, you know, smaller neighborhood, building social cohesion. And I think we're moving towards that more slow-paced rather than that fast-paced. And this is something that we need to capture as well. I think we also need to look on a citywide scale. And this is often the problem that we have. Also, both, you know, from the local level, but also on a bigger scale. But how can we actually make sure that we look at the solutions from a citywide scale, and what are the lessons that we can learn from that? We need to have that integrated approach. Just recently, I think Ian, you brought that up as well, you know, that importance of actually planning and health, you know, how do we actually bring that together? And as UN Habitat, we launched just recently with WHO a source book on how we can actually integrate the health with the planning. And I think it's really an opportune moment to actually look at those integrated approaches. So more that holistic thinking, integrated approaches. We need to also think flexibly. And I was seeing that as well, both on the local level, but also on a bigger scale. You know, how can we be more flexible? How can we look at the multifunctional use of public space? You know, a lot has actually also gone into trying to have that physical distancing. So local markets, how do we ensure that they actually get adequate space to continue to sell their products, that the vendors can sell their products? And that is taking then space close to the market in another open space to be able to accommodate that. So we need to have that flexibility use of space, and that then also requires a change in bylaws and regulations that local governments have to be able to accommodate that. I think the management of public space is key, especially in this era, and a lesson learned going forward. You know, how do we actually manage public space better than what we've been doing? And there's so many different ways of doing that. It's not only the role of local government to do it. You know, communities have a role, private sector has a role. There's a plethora of ways of actually trying to manage public space in a better way. Connectivity was brought up as well, you know, and we need to move away. And I loved what Ayanda was saying. We need to restitch our cities. We need to restore our cities. And I think this is a way of doing that, you know, looking at the connectivity, the networks, and being able to ensure that there's adequate public space for all, making sure that there's, and I think we've seen that globally, that there is such an inequality in the distribution of space on a city level. And Ayanda's picture was really telling on that, where you have a sort of a more informal community living next to a golf course. And I think this is the really sad impact of a lot of the policies that have been going on in our cities. Maybe just to touch upon some of those lessons learned with regards to this source book that we launched just recently. And what I would like to stress is we need to look at places as assets. We need to make sure that public space is an asset and that the government actually understands what an asset it is. We need to look at people as assets. So the communities, what they can contribute, they have multiple ways of trying to contribute to this. We need to look at the processes as assets as well. We need to have that integrated, holistic approach and to take that forward. And finally, I think, communication is key. Communication, partnerships, and I think through that, we can actually reimagine our cities in a better way and be able to take that forward. And thank you very much. That was just a few thoughts from the presentations that were made, and I'm really excited going into this phase of learning from what's been going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. That was a very nice summary, actually, of the whole session, and also our time is almost up. But maybe I just want to give the word back to all our speakers for maybe one round, seeing this great summary of Cecilia, but also now after you've heard to all these different presentations, is there something that is on your mind and you want to kind of respond to that? Maybe just kind of give a open floor to our speakers.
I'll maybe just give a soundbite.
Yeah.
That essentially what we've been proven is it's one thing to have government and another thing to have governance. And clearly there's very, very different standards and definitions. And I think what we saw with a number of the case studies today was that those most in need of help through governance are the ones that are most failed. And as you say, that we now need to reapproach how we see failure so that we can move forward and make a more positive urban experience for those who are at the bottom of the scale, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. We see this in many places of the world, right? That actually it's mainly these kind of community groups that are there for people and push things to move forward, particularly for those people that lack resources and so on. Other comments from our other Anna?
Yeah. I first I would like to thank all of you first for preparing this session, and also to my fellow speakers. I share many things with Cecilia's summary, in which I have learned many things from different places, and to see actually that we are somehow having very similitudes now, many things that we share, and that's what I think. One of the things that pop in my mind when listening to you, is that we all are looking at communities as this strength force, like the ones that could really activate. Government would be the facilitator to do that, but the communities are the ones that make it powerful. And that's what I would like to respond to the question that was in the QA by Richard Hart, that said, what's the difference between public space and collective space? I don't know, really. I don't know what's the difference, but what I think is that public space maybe for citizens is very big. So it's something that only the state or the government could develop, manage, design, and provide. Because when we think it's like this very big network that happen all around the city. So maybe that's too big, the scale is too big. And collective space is a smaller scale, no? So it goes to communities, and it's a caring space. People, not only defined by territory, but also by people that share interests, could have this more intimate feeling, or more intimate activities, or a more profound connections in these places that I believe should happen more around the city. It's not only sidewalks, it's not only parks. It could be a building that has this collective space for people that that could do any kind of activity now. So it goes also to what Jason mentioned, the pubs, which are these public spaces managed or owned by a private property or a private collective. So I think property is not important anymore. It could be public or private. Also, what is public now? It should be open to all. It should be accessible to all. It should be open 24 hours. It should be of a public property, but that doesn't happen necessarily. So I think property should be put aside and think more of this collective space, which is also more flexible, is also temporal, and it could adapt to the different moments that the citizens, or in this case, the neighbors, the neighborhoods could get, you know, like we have lived in this pandemic right now. So basically.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And what we saw in many cities, like also in New York, that many of those pub spaces were the first, or Hudson Yards, and the first that were entirely closed off, right? When the pandemic came and didn't serve anyone, right? So anyway, I think, how about the other contributors, Ayanda and Jason? Is there any last feedback you want to give?
Right. I think I agree with the sense that history is still with us. I think so. It still works with us. We see it. So the vulnerabilities that we see in our cities, they didn't just fall from the sky, you know, they are connected with history. And whether it's about people who came to our cities as migrant labor, or people who are experiencing homelessness, or informal workers, there's a history connected to that. And this is how our cities are designed or planned according to that. So I think I agree also with Cecilia that we are not learning effectively from history. Like if I think about the case of South Africa, we've got this history of activism because of apartheid. So how do we leverage on that in terms of addressing the issues that we have? If I make another example of HIV and AIDS, one of the important lessons is the fact that we established like community health workers to help government to interface or to touch the ground. So in terms of public spaces, it's not something that you can learn from. Maybe think about community planners, you know, to bridge this gap. So I'm saying that there's more that we can learn, and already we have. And just lastly, to say that this is an opportunity for us to be radical in terms of solutions. Radical in terms of how do we make our cities inclusive, and also how do we make them equitable. So I think if we are not taking up this opportunity of the pandemic, we'll be missing the boat. Thank you.
Jason?
I also see there's what looks like an excellent question for Ayanda, so I don't want to preclude that from being answered.
Okay. Yeah. Ying Fen, do you want to put forward the question that is raised there?
Oh, you say about collective space?
Oh no, this one already answered, I think. But
okay, so you talk about another one.
Oh yeah, I can, or otherwise I can also do.
But I think actually all this question may connect to each other together, because it seems like a follow after the Cecilia's comments. It seems like now the pandemic, all this issue push us try to rethink about what's the definition of public space and what's the role of the community or government, and how this process, how could we really collective together. But also I think the Another question just popped up from one auditor, Ying Ling. She's asking, the question is direct for she's asking about, because in your presentation, you talk about this kind of, the community people, they will use the space out of their house, their apartment, because they need this kind of public space to be their social networking or something else, and they just need this space. But how could we really prevent the outbreak in the community when they demand this kind of public space so badly? And I think why this question pop up, because like in Hong Kong, it's a very dense city, so it seems like people need to use like lots of the space, maybe lots of restaurant or some government-owned public space out of their household to support them to do all this kind of life things. So so I think the question want to know more about when we are talking about we need to have this kind of new kind of public space, but how could we really contain the pandemic in this kind of space?
I think that's particularly for Ayanda.
Ayanda, yeah. So maybe Ayanda, could you
in view of the situation that when people have to go home and basically cannot really do social distancing, no? Because they, as you say, like maybe I don't know, 9 people or more living on 40 square meters, right? Anything one can do. Ayanda, do you want to still answer to that question? It's actually in many places we feel this challenge. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, because even when it comes to masks, maybe the communities won't have money to sort of change the masks and stuff like that, the PPEs. So it's really difficult. So I don't know how to answer it. People just live and infect each other, and then the resilience and stuff is very difficult. I don't really know how to answer it. Because really there are options, you know.
Well, if I might just jump in, it sort of ties to the point I was maybe going to make earlier about how space is so politicized, and I think you bring up a great point that many governments are asking marginalized groups to stay out of public space, to stay home. These are the same groups that are living in high density, in many cases, unsanitary conditions because of underlying structural problems. And you have this sort of policing of public space under the guise of liberalism, right? Collectivism, but what that's really doing is shutting down access. And I don't have an answer necessarily, but I wanted to respond to Cecilia's point about whether we can use this time to rethink, to restitch and to repurpose government, and whether it might also be time to depoliticize public space and think again of public space as a commons and try to de-attach it to systems of political parties or partisan issues. Because the second you sort of radicalize public space, you also politicize it, and then you cause these reactions. And so how do we think of it as a sort of commons, once again, that can bring together different ideologies rather than further these divisions?
Okay, it seems like we have still a lot of food for thoughts for more sessions upcoming, or is there anything that Cecilia want to answer to this?
I just would like to say that in a previous webinar, we discussed about the trust that is needed, especially during these difficult times. Trust in other people that you are in touch with because of social distancing, trust in local government, trust in the national government, trust to institutions in general. And this is an issue that is actually affecting also some countries. It is very important that when we say public space, we mean solidarity among people, but also, joint effort from the top down, especially for those that have to take tough decisions during these difficult times with the local communities. So trust is also part of one of the key elements for public space, I think. Cecilia, you want to say something?
No, I actually think that now, just like Jason was saying, I think now is the time that we can actually have an impact and to try and change that dynamic. And I think there is a willingness actually now at this time to actually grab every kind of opportunity to actually change the way things are. And may not be every government, but I think a lot of the governments that we've been seeing have really, put out their hands and said, look, please, how can we actually do better? How can we try and contain this? How can we work with communities? I think there is a willingness. And Ayanda, who works from government, maybe has more of an idea of that. But I think I'm seeing that, like government here in Kenya, government in Indonesia, we're seeing that there is a willingness. We just need to try and support, redirect.
I think I agree with Cecilia, and also I think the point of having regional platforms for people to learn from each other, I think is important, because I know working from government, if there's something happening, in another city, there's something about competition when it comes to cities. So once they hear something is happening in Kenya, so in South Africa, they would want, to do that. But also I think the relationship that we like to talk about as important between universities and also the cities is so difficult, especially when it comes to practical matters, and also when it comes to procuring services of universities. But I think more and more universities also are tired of doing things, in corners and not really things that are responsive to society. So we see that cross-sectorally, people want to work together. And in Africa, by establishing this center on African public spaces, we want to bring in universities and government departments, but also civil society organizations, so that we can work together and think about developing new ways of generating knowledge. How do we strengthen the curriculum, also working in communities, bringing students to work in communities, and also government to say, okay, there's bursaries, around public space, and that's the only way to change things, to work in live projects around public space, so that we can transform our attitudes and maybe develop new theories and so forth and so on.
Thank you very much. I think that time is about over. So I just want to give back again to Luisa, and before, thanks to all our fantastic panelists. So each time we learn more and have new ideas for the next sessions. So Luisa, do you want to close the session?
Yes, just to say thank you to all the speakers and all the attendees, and to give the announcement regarding the next webinar that will take place, as you know, on Thursday. It will be about the role of renewable energy in post-COVID-19 public spaces. And this is already arranged, so we will send out the invitation quite soon, hopefully tomorrow. So thank you again for joining today. Thank you to all our speakers, Ian, Anna, Jason, Ayanda, and Cecilia. And thank you all attendees. We will meet again next week. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.